You're the owner of a small business, which means you're also the tech guy, and HR, and personal assistant, and head honcho, and intern. You could use another pair of hands, like the experts you'll find at Verizon's Small Business Days, April 21st through 27th. Get a free tech check, special deals, and more. Call 1-800-483-4428 or visit verizon.com/smallbusiness to book your appointment. Verizon Business.
This episode is brought to you by Choiceology, an original podcast from Charles Schwab. Hosted by Katie Milkman, an award-winning behavioral scientist and author of the best-selling book, How to Change, Choiceology is a show about the psychology and economics behind our decisions. Hear true stories from Nobel laureates, authors, athletes, and everyday people about why we do the things we do. Listen to Choiceology at schwab.com/podcast or wherever you listen.
If you're a white person in America and your family's been here for a long enough time, the odds that your family owns slaves are pretty good. A 2023 project found that among the living members of Congress, presidents, Supreme Court justices, and governors in this country, 1 in 5 are direct descendants of slaveholders. The PBS series Finding Your Roots does this kind of genealogical review pretty often. Here's CNN's Anderson Cooper finding out how his fourth great-grandfather, an enslaver, met his end. This clip starts with the host, Henry Louis Gates Jr.
Boykin was murdered by a rebellious slave. Wow. Your ancestor was beaten to death with a farm hoe.
Oh my God. That's amazing. This is incredible. I'm blown away.
You think he deserved it?
Yeah.
You do?
I have no doubt.
It's a horrible way to die, Anderson.
He had 12 slaves. I don't feel bad for him.
Okay.
Now, of course, most of us don't have access to a historian like Henry Louis Gates and his research team. It takes a lot of work to dig this stuff up yourself, especially if your family doesn't want to talk about it. This is Living at Odds, a series from Slate about what holds us together when so much threatens to break us apart. I'm Courtney Martin, the host of Slate's advice podcast, How To. Now, so far in this series, we've talked with people who are in conflict with each other and with the political climate more broadly. Today's episode is not a story like that. It's a story about being in conflict with your ancestors and the terrible things they might have done. And once you discover that history, how do you begin to reckon with your family's role in it?
I got to sit next to my grandmother, and I remember asking her about her people, and she just looked at me and she said, "Don't go looking for what you can't handle."
Coming up, you'll meet people who have ignored that kind of advice. I'll talk with someone who has started that journey with the help of a genealogist who has a story of her own. First, though, we'll start with some familiar names from history, names that are still very much alive today. Plessy versus Ferguson is a Supreme Court case that you probably learned about in school. The impact of the court's decision was vast and deeply damaging.
In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation was not unconstitutional so long as the separate facilities were equal in quality. This is where we got the separate but equal doctrine that allowed segregation to continue.
That's Dahlia Lithwick. She writes for Slate about the courts and the law, and she also hosts the podcast Amicus. We asked her to give us a primer on the decision and to tell us more about Plessy and Ferguson.
The original case stemmed from an 1892 incident in New Orleans. In Louisiana, it had recently become law that blacks and whites had to have separate train cars and that any passenger caught in a train car he didn't belong in was guilty of a misdemeanor. So a civil rights group, the Citizens Committee, decided to test the law. They recruited a free person of color, Homer Plessy, to buy a ticket for the white train car. On June 7th, 1892, he boarded the train, was asked to leave, and didn't. And then he was arrested by a private detective hired by the Citizens Committee specifically to arrest him and charge him with violating the exact law they wanted to take to court.
That's Homer Plessy. So, who's Ferguson?
He was a judge in the parish of New Orleans. When the Citizens Committee sued, John Howard Ferguson ruled in the state's favor and said the train car was legal as long as the train didn't leave Louisiana. The Louisiana Supreme Court affirmed his decision when Plessy appealed. And when the case made it to the Supreme Court of the United States, the Supreme Court ruled 7-1 that the government was allowed to segregate in the name of health, safety, and morality, so long as these separate facilities were equal in quality. The lone dissenter, Justice John Marshall Harlan, argued that the law was clearly exclusionary and that the Constitution was colorblind. But separate but equal was good enough across the country for a good half century, until Plessy v. Ferguson was overturned by another famous case in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education.
Plessy is no longer the law of the land, but in a lot of ways, and for a lot of Black and brown people in this country, the damage was done, and will probably take many more generations to undo. So, with a legacy that complicated and that difficult to unravel, where do you start? And what if your last name happens to be Plessy?
Well, we didn't discuss it at home, but in elementary school, they let me know that my ancestor's name was spelled like mine.
Keith Plessy is a descendant of Homer Plessy, the train passenger who took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. When Keith was a kid, his last name sometimes put him under the spotlight.
One of my teachers said, well, Keith's name is spelled just like Homer Plessy. So when they were teaching the lesson, they would ask me to stand in front of the classroom. I was kind of discouraged about the story. I didn't like it. The vague story was like a paragraph in the history book. And it only told about how he went to Supreme Court, how he lost, and how separate but equal came out of his case. To me, it seemed like they were trying to make him look like the poster child for segregation.
Phoebe Ferguson, on the other hand, grew up with a last name that attracted less attention. She didn't learn about her family's connection to the Supreme Court decision until she was an adult, but she did learn about the case in 4th grade.
I remember thinking, well, I'm a Ferguson, and I'm from New Orleans, so could I be related? But I don't remember following through on that curiosity.
So when did you first know?
About 30 years later. I got a phone call one day from a guy who was asking, are you Phoebe Ferguson? Yes. He said, well, I've been looking for you for 10 years. Oh, really? He said, well, I bought your great-great-grandfather's house. The judge in Plessy versus Ferguson. And I just went, oh, my goodness. I had just received a box from my sister, and in the box was an envelope that said Ferguson genealogy. And I pulled out the genealogy and ran my finger down the list, and there it was, Judge John Howard Ferguson.
Phoebe's a filmmaker, so her first instinct was to tell this story. And as someone who cared about racial justice, she wanted the story to be about making things right.
The first thing I did was go to the public library. And I went up to the counter and I said to the fellow, hi, I'm doing research on Homer Plessy, and I am wondering, what materials he might have. I said, I'm doing a documentary called Looking for Plessy. And he just smiled and said, well, you found one of them. I'm a relative to Homer Plessy's ancestors.
And that was Greg Osborne.
Who is like a cousin of yours or something, Keith?
Yeah, he's a tour guide in the city. And yeah, he's related. Oh, it's a long story. He's related to 7 children that came from the first cohabitation of a Frenchman and a former slave woman.
That librarian and local history buff was the first in a growing group of people who helped Phoebe learn more about her family and helped connect her with others, including Keith Plessy. Keith and Phoebe met at a book signing for a historian and mutual friend.
The person that introduced us is Keith Weldon Medley. He just recently passed away, he's author. And his book is entitled We as Free Men, Plessy versus Ferguson.
This other Keith, Keith Weldon Medley, did a ton of research for this book and mapped out both Plessy and Ferguson's ancestry. Because of this work, he met both Keith and Phoebe and decided to bring them together.
Keith Weldon Medley Told me, would you like to meet a Ferguson? So he never told Phoebe a thing. so Phoebe doesn't know what's going on. So when I walked up to her, I'm smiling and I shake her hand and I say, oh, hi, I'm Keith Plessy.
And I said, hi, I'm Phoebe Ferguson. I'm so sorry for my ancestors' role in this history and, the years of desegregation that came afterwards.
I was shocked about, first of all, the apology. I was not expecting an apology for everything, history, slavery, discrimination, whatever, you name it. So I said, hey, slow down. We wasn't born around that time. We can do something different.
He just smiled, and without missing a beat, he said, it's no longer Plessy versus Ferguson. It's Plessy and Ferguson. We don't have to put up any barriers because they were never there to begin with. They're only actually there in the imagination, of the public.
For Phoebe, this wasn't just the start of a new friendship. It was forgiveness.
Well, it was such a relief. It encapsulated exactly who Keith is, because the statement that we could be Plessy and Ferguson completely changed what would have been the likely outcome of my learning this legacy and having to live with it, but not really having a way to make a change. And the next thing is that Keith invited me over to his family's house for lunch, and we had gumbo and bread pudding and, a real New Orleans breaking bread.
This is the way you hope reconciliation goes, right? You meet someone whose your ancestors hurt, you talk about your shared history, you make amends, and you move on. But Keith and Phoebe went a little further.
So when I commented that it's no longer Plessy versus Ferguson, it's Plessy and Ferguson, I just wanted to look at us being friends. So just out of the heart, that those words came, and I had no idea I was saying what our organization would eventually be.
Together, they started something called the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation. They speak at schools from kindergarten to universities, and so far, they've placed 6 historic markers around their home city of New Orleans.
The markers that we put up over a 15-year span is probably the brainchild of Keith Medley, because he was telling us when we were forming the organization that, if you don't put up markers about what people resisted, how people resisted and achieved things here in the city, and you talk about the Black community, that people would never know we existed.
So, Plessy versus Ferguson became Plessy and Ferguson. They're working together and doing kind of a little unity tour. It feels perfect. But it's also not usually how this goes. For most of us, once we found out that our ancestors were responsible for something vile, there isn't a Keith who wants to collaborate with us. There's no path to easy absolution. And honestly, maybe it shouldn't be so easy. Making sense of your family history and making peace with your ancestors is a long, long process. One that takes a lot to start, and one that probably doesn't ever really end. More after the break.
If you've listened to the How To podcast for a while, then you know how important acceptance is when it comes to personal growth. And do you know who else is big on acceptance? Discover. You see, Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. That's a whole lot of places and a whole lot of acceptance, which is great for Discover, but even better for you. Based on the 2024 Nielsen report, learn more at discover.com/creditcard. This episode is brought to you by Choiceology, an original podcast from Charles Schwab. Choiceology is a show all about the psychology and economics behind our decisions. Each episode shares the latest research in behavioral science and dives into themes like, can we learn to make smarter decisions, and the power of do-overs? The show is hosted by Katie Milkman. She's an award-winning behavioral scientist, professor at the Wharton School, and author of the best-selling book, How to Change. In each episode, Katie talks to authors, historians, athletes, Nobel laureates, and everyday people about why we make irrational choices and how we can make better ones to avoid costly mistakes. Listen and subscribe at schwab.com/podcast or find it wherever you listen.
This is Living at Odds. I'm Courtney Martin. Like Phoebe Ferguson, I think a lot of us have these intuitions about who we come from, these little voices inside of us whispering that we should pursue our family's truth. But it's easy to ignore these instincts in a world that wants you moving fast and forward at all times. There's so much to be gained from looking back, even at very intimate histories that are very painful. Just ask genealogist Kellie Farrish, who started doing some research on the site Ancestry.com to find her Black Southern family. She ended up finding one of her ancestors in the inventory section of a slave owner's will.
When I was about 30, I did an ancestry search. It allowed me to put in my grandmother's name. And she was born in 1919, and then all of her information showed up. And it allowed me to take that back to 1870. So I followed the head of household down, and I just discovered all of these people that my family never talked about. Because I always thought that the family was from Mobile, Alabama. That's where my grandmother and my mother had lived since 1948, 1950. But this was taking us back to this tiny place called Utah, Alabama. And it was in Greene County near Tuscaloosa. It's very small, but there was an antebellum tour that used to go through there. The state of Alabama had this tour, like a bus tour you could take, and you could see all of the houses that the formerly enslaved lived in. Come to find out, those were all of my family, that my family was born there and that they had never left from 1819 to the present. So we still live there. We still have land there.
Kellie spent a long time figuring out her own history, digging through deeds and wills and estate files, wading through the hard truths about what her ancestors probably went through.
I can't even explain what it's like to see your third great-grandfather listed in an inventory of someone's will, and he's worth $1,800. And his mother is worth $750. And then you start learning all of these things.
Now, Kellie is helping other people do the same thing as a genealogist and research consultant. Kellie's clients often have strikingly similar stories. There's that one older relative who knows a lot about the family history, but won't say anything. Maybe because there's not a lot of known history to share, and maybe because it's just too painful.
A lot of times it's a generation that either was very pensive and didn't speak. I get a lot of people that had a mysterious mother or a father that wouldn't talk about the past. And they're always from the deep South. And they usually were sharecroppers long after the system was over, long after slavery. So you have people that lived in this kind of pseudo slave state from 1865 to like 1940, 1930. And those generations of people, if you left that area, they didn't talk about what happened there. So I'm in California. A lot of my clients are in Detroit, Ohio, places where the Great Migration took them out of the South. So to get back to Africa is a tall feat because it just wasn't built into American chattel slavery to let us continue to know our past.
Right.
We became this new thing, this African American thing, which is an actual ethnicity. So we are a people, and our origins are in the South as this new people that we are. And so taking someone back to that point, I try to explain to them, this is kind of your Africa in a sense. You are very American, unlike anybody else that came here. What I try to explain to people is the journey, because the census takes you every 10 years. So we look for little things to explain how the family progressed, going from not being literate to being literate, going from being a farmhand to actually being a farmer, and then going from a farmer to a non-agricultural position. Maybe you're working as a Pullman porter now. Maybe you are doing some mechanic work. That's huge, because in order to do that, you usually had to be literate.
Kellie's work is, in this way, strikingly optimistic. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of emotional upside to learning that your family was considered property. But Kellie is very good at pointing out the ways in which the truth actually can set you free. And at the very least, confirm that your ancestors were badass survivors. She also works with the descendants of enslavers, and she brokers the kinds of conversations that can lead to healing.
Many of my clients are white and their families own slaves. They've already done the genealogy. They want to know about the descendants of the enslaved. What happened to them once
of
they left?
Those who were enslaved by their ancestors. Yeah.
That's right. And so that's what I specialize
in. Order to directly repair with those people?
Repair with them, have a conversation, apologize, reconciliation. There's so many forms that these conversations come in. But what they're really interested in knowing is what happened. Like, what did you go through to get to this point? Are you okay?
As we heard earlier, with Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson, the answer to that question was yes. Keith was okay, and he wanted Phoebe to be okay too. But for other people, this has to be a much longer and more formal conversation.
We have a group called Coming to the Table. Descendants of enslavers and the descendants of enslaved come together and have a conversation. And everyone feels better by it. It's just something that alleviates the pain in your heart about what happened. And you're trying to make America a better place. And the only way you can do that is to figure out what you need and how you feel and what happened to you. And I'll tell you what happened to me.
Kellie, I'm ready to quit all my other jobs and just follow you around. That's how interesting and important I find all of this. It's incredible.
Yes. And you end up, because it's a people business, you just end up running into people that need your help.
More from Kellie and one of the people who needed her help after the break. This episode is brought to you by Defender. Are you a trailblazer, a risk taker, someone with countless tales of epic adventures? Then you won't want to miss Destination Defender, an epic weekend festival designed for Defender owners and enthusiasts, taking place in Port Jervis, New York from May 16th through 18th. This unforgettable weekend includes inspiring talks, off-road driving courses, chef tastings, and live music. If you're ready for adventure, the Defender is too. It's a vehicle built for drivers capable of great things, whether you're venturing into uncharted territory or just escaping for a weekend getaway. This May, connect with fellow adventure seekers at Destination Defender, an unforgettable weekend festival in Port Jervis, New York, created for those who embrace the impossible. Enjoy outdoor activities, live music, chef tastings, and more, all at Destination Defender, May 16th through 18th. To learn more, please visit DestinationDefenderUSA.com.
This episode is brought to you by Notion. Email is a primary tool in our work and our lives, but it can be tedious and stressful, and it's always coming in, and that's why we're introducing Notion Mail. It's the inbox that thinks like you. automated, personalized, and flexible to finally work the way you work. With AI that learns what matters to you, it can organize your inbox, label messages, draft replies, and even schedule meetings. No manual sorting required. I'm a user of Notion, and the thing that I love about it is it is so easy to set up. With the AI organized inbox, you can tell Notion AI what types of emails are important to you, and it'll automatically label and sort them as they arrive. And to stay focused and distraction-free, you can split your inbox into custom views like topic or urgency or sender. And you can fly through emails with snippets by using one-click email templates to quickly send whatever is repetitive for you, like intros or follow-ups or thank you notes. You can even include attachments and scheduling links. Get Notion Mail for free right now at notion.com/howto and try the inbox that thinks like you. That's all lowercase letters. notion.com/howto to get Notion Mail for free right now. When you use our link, you're supporting our show. Notion.com/howto.
This episode is brought to you by Defender. Are you a trailblazer, a risk taker, someone with countless tales of epic adventures? Then you won't want to miss Destination Defender, an epic weekend festival designed for Defender owners and enthusiasts taking place in Port Jervis, New York from May 16th through 18th. This unforgettable weekend includes inspiring talks, off-road driving courses, chef tastings, and live music. If you're ready for adventure, the Defender is too. It's a vehicle built for drivers capable of great things, whether you're venturing into uncharted territory or just escaping for a weekend getaway. This May, connect with fellow adventure seekers at Destination Defender, an unforgettable weekend festival in Port Jervis, New York, created for those who embrace the impossible. Enjoy outdoor activities, live music, chef tastings, and more, all at Destination Defender, May 16th through 18th. To learn more, please visit DestinationDefenderUSA.com. If you're enjoying this episode of Living at Odds, the conversation continues in a Slate Plus bonus episode. You'll hear more from my conversation with Kellie Farrish about reparative genealogy and about the research tools she uses to piece together a family history. If you're a Slate Plus member, you can listen right now. And if you're not, subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of the How To Show page. Or visit slate.com/howtoplus to get access to this bonus episode wherever you listen. That's slate.com/howtoplus. This is Living at Odds. I'm Courtney Martin. During my conversation with Kellie Farrish, she got me thinking so much about how learning about our long ago ancestors shapes our identities right now. And she told me the story of one of her recent clients. I just had to meet her.
My name is Kate Baron-Alicante. I live in Philadelphia. I am a financial activist. I work in financial services, but I have a background in nonprofit social change work as well, and I combine those in everything I do.
Kate grew up in the Northeast, but her family, who is white, had ties elsewhere.
My dad is from Europe, and he was an immigrant. My mom is from the South. And so I was much more interested in all things outside of the US. So growing up in the Northeast, I had a lot of judgment and sort of sense of superiority to the South, which I don't think is uncommon.
Despite her feelings about the South, Kate's family did make trips down there to visit relatives. And the family that was there was not interested in unpacking the past.
Thibodaux, Louisiana is in Lafourche Parish. My family lived there for many, many generations, maybe 5 or 6 generations. And maybe a handful of times we made a long, long 3-day car ride journey down to see my grandmother and my family in her small little 1-story house in South Louisiana. And everyone would come, and there'd be the kids' table and the grown-up table. And for one of those meals when I was 5 or 6, I got to sit next to my grandmother, and I was really excited. It kind of scared me, but I was also intrigued by her. And I remember asking her about her people, which I, was carrying this question obviously for a long time. And she said, she just looked at me and very kind of pointedly said, "Don't go looking for what you can't handle," in a thicker South Louisiana accent. And I just I think, just sort of blinked at her. And I was like, just put my head down and continued eating because I wasn't expecting her to say that. I thought she'd say something else, which she could have shared with me, things she knew, but that was her response.
That comment stayed with Kate well into adulthood. So did this lingering question she had. What was so bad about her Southern family that it had to be kept secret? Then, while doing hurricane recovery work in Louisiana during the 2000s, Kate started researching her ancestors from the area around Thibodaux.
I began to dig into my grandmother's history, like who were her people? And I began to study, starting with my grandmother's name, where she was born, when she was born. And I began a process of a couple years of doing like a side family ancestry search. I did a lot of work, went to a lot of courthouses and churches and read original documents in French and Spanish. I learned a lot about who my people were, on paper anyway.
A librarian pointed Kate to a set of records showing slaveholders from the year 1850.
And that's where I found my, how many great grandfathers is he? Kellie can help me with that. But his name was Simon Pierre LeBlanc, and he was a sugar planter in Lafourche. And he owned like a list of people by age and by color and by gender. It is an immediate, strong reaction when you see that for the first time. My blood went cold looking at it. I just sort of stared at it because I had no context for this. I think it's, in hindsight, probably pretty obvious that like if your family was in this place and white, you probably are going to bump into an intimate connection with enslavement. But you can't prepare for that moment. It was like in a movie where like the birds stop chirping and the wind stops blowing, and it's just, you're in a bubble staring at that, knowing that was there all along.
Through her research, Kate also uncovered information about her great-grandfather. This was the father of her grandmother, the same one who'd once warned young Kate not to dig too deep into family history. Gustave was this ancestor's name, and in the late 1800s and early 1900s, he had managed sugar plantations in the Thibodaux area.
He would have been in his 20s, working already as an overseer when the Thibodaux massacre happened.
The Thibodaux massacre took place in 1887, when Black workers on sugar plantations attempted to organize for better pay and improvements in their miserable working conditions. They were met with local paramilitary forces and white supremacist groups that ended up attacking workers and their families. The total number killed is unknown, but estimates range from 30 to 60 people, with many more, perhaps hundreds, injured. Kate doesn't know whether her great-grandfather Gustave was directly involved in the violence against Black workers in Thibodaux, but she does know he was a plantation overseer in the area at that time, which meant he was part of the power structure those workers were standing up to. And Kate says her connection to Gustave has led her to examine how she might be supporting, directly or indirectly, modern-day injustices, like the one that happened more than 100 years ago in Thibodaux. One thing to keep in mind, Kate was able to discover this part of her family history because there was a paper trail for her white ancestors. Black Americans who attempt this kind of genealogical research have a much harder time finding records for their enslaved family members. Often, those records simply don't exist.
For those of us who are white to have this information and to not share it. It is a form of hoarding, right? And I think that it might, on the surface, feel sort of like self-protection or self-serving or whatever you would call it. But these truths, these things that happened in our country's history, it's as if we have termites. And so if you happen to pull something back and see there are termites there and then decide, I'm just going to paper over it and pretend they're not there, that's not a solution.
So what is the solution? For Kate, it was two-pronged: sharing this information with her family and also airing it out in the open. Kellie is accompanying her in that tender process, especially the latter part.
The end goal is to have this conversation with the descendants of the enslaved. So we want Kate and the descendants of those people that had a relationship with Kate's family in the early 1800s, in up to the early 1900s, to sit down and talk about this. And like Kate said, it's like bringing an exterminator out to remove the termites. Because on both sides of the conversation, these discoveries are so important because it unlocks memories that you don't necessarily have, but your ancestors kept secret. Like her grandmother knows some of these stories. She knows them well enough not to tell them. And it's the same thing with my grandmother. She knows the stories well enough not to talk about them. We're just on the cusp of getting it right. And I think it's very important for people like Kate to have a platform. And that's what I'm hoping does not go away, is the platform for people to have these discussions. Like this podcast is amazing. The fact that this is a topic is amazing. The history of American chattel slavery is the history of white people. People always associate that as being the history of Black people. That is the history of white people. And we're trying to squeeze out what we were doing at the time, other than, being servants, because we're not mentioned. And Kate is saying, let's go and find these people and let's mention them by name, not by circumstance. And even the movement to say enslaved instead of slave, because no one is born a slave. You are a human being that has been enslaved. That language has come about because of these conversations. So there's a lot of integrity behind the people that come to the table for this work. It's actually a beautiful thing, and it's less contentious than you'd think.
This is like a group project, right? This is like a generational group project. And I'm imagining, you as a little girl, Kellie, and you as a little girl, Kate, in the 80s, like having these beginner mind questions that elders shut down, but that won't be shut down. And that now we're getting to see the fruit of some of those questions, and this generation, some of us, trying to take responsibility. And it's not a small thing. It's a heavy weight. It can also be a lightness to finally have these conversations.
For me, it's actually not lightness, but this journey, this work has shown to me time and time again, like a strengthening inside me, like a solidifying. Something solidifies in me that before was flimsy or tentative or superficial or unsure. That's the feeling that I want to have. This feeling of like, sometimes doing the hard thing is hard, but like on the other side, there's something so fortifying about having done the hard thing that is the right thing. This feeling of like power and inner strength, and like I know who I'm accountable to through this work. It's not lost on me that we're having this conversation in this moment in history in the US. And many of us are wondering, like, what can I do? And I think if these things were easy, they would have been done already. Like, we would have done them. And for me, integrity is, like, conceptually, I'm sure, something enticing to me. But it's also just like, it's my work. When people say, like, do your work, get your people, like, this is my work. These are my people. And I think, like, there is a reclamation that white folks in America need to do with our own history so that we can fully show up present today in this country. White Americans in particular have work ahead of us, rather than to assume, oh, let's just let this happen at the policy level. Like, maybe things aren't going to happen at the policy level for a while, but like, what else can we do in our individual lives, in our families, that can be a part of a bigger movement and push in history right now? Even if you are a recent immigrant, you come into this story and you're placed somewhere in the story because of the characters and plot that has occurred before you got here, right? So it's, do you want to continue playing that role, or do you want to play a different role than the one you have?
This point feels so salient for the series we are exploring here. Great stories are supposed to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But the story of America is not, or at least not solely, a great story. It is an ongoing tragedy and an ongoing triumph. It is a story without end. And each of us are characters in this story without end. We inherit a plot, a sometimes very ugly plot, and we have to figure out what to do next. Each generation is essentially authoring the next chapter. We don't sit down at a blank page. We sit down at a half-written, sometimes redacted, waterlogged journal. Which is all to say, when it comes to our family story and how it intertwines with the American story, we don't have total control. We also do have a lot more agency than we sometimes think. At least that's what Kellie and Kate, Phoebe and Keith all believe.
We have to face it. It's there. We're going to be dealing with it for quite a while. But I would say there's an emergence of a consciousness that is about progress. And we find people in our journey that are walking that same path with us. And a lot of times, if you merge with those folks and you continue to build on that you can succeed in these crazy times. Learn from our mistakes, see where we were weak in areas where we should build, and eventually this system can work for us. We addressed a EDI class at Tulane University the very next day after the election. So what I told the class was, you have to look inside yourself and not let it affect you. The darkest time on the planet is just before the sun comes up. And we are that sun. We have to remember to be the light in times of darkness.
On the next Living at Odds, a special episode of one of my favorite Slate podcasts, Death, Sex, and Money. Host Anna Sale talks with an LGBTQ rights lobbyist in West Virginia. He's helped pass 20 anti-discrimination ordinances across that conservative-leaning state. Now, his policy victories are facing dire challenges in an increasingly hostile political landscape.
Suddenly, all these Republicans that used to support our bills as sponsors didn't want to support the bills anymore. They had been scared away.
Now he's trying to figure out how to move forward with fewer and fewer allies. Don't miss it. This episode was produced by Maura, Currie, and Rosie Belson. Merritt Jacob mixed this episode and composed original music. Our supervising producer is Joel Meyer. Thanks to Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson, and to Kellie Farrish and Kate Barron-Alicante for sharing their stories of courage and repair with us. Thanks also to Julia Rhodes Davis for turning me on to the amazing film Acts of Reparation, and to Kellie's impactful work. My Slate colleagues Dahlia Lithwick and Sophie Summergrad helped with this episode. Thanks also to Slate's Hillary Fry, Katie Rayford, Caitlin Schneider, Alexandra Cole, and to Ivy Lise Simones, who created our artwork. Thank you to Derek John for his help with this series. How To was created by Charles Duhigg. And a very special thanks to the Heartland Foundation, which provided funding for this series. We want to hear what you think of this series. Have you ever thought about searching for your ancestors or pursuing some kind of repair? What happened? We would love to hear your stories. Email us at howto@slate.com. And if you've never heard our parent show, How To, well, friend, you have years of practical advice on nearly every subject waiting for you. Just search for How To wherever you get your podcast apps. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode. I'm Courtney Martin.